Greek philosopher Plato's Allegory of the Cave describes a hypothetical in which a group of prisoners have been chained inside of a dark cave for their entire lives. They see nothing except for one partially lit wall directly in front of them, where shadows are projected regularly. The prisoners, with no other frame of reference, believe that these shadows are reality. They truly think the world is made of shadows. In actuality, these shadows are created by other people on a higher level of the cave. They roam about in front of a fire, holding up models of animals and objects that exist in the outside world while saying their names, thus giving the prisoners their view of reality. The allegory of the cave is meant to be a way to convey the strength of science and philosophy, reaching enlightenment by finding the truth of why and how things are, not just accepting what we see as the whole explanation. Now, you may be thinking, that's cool and all, but why on earth are you talking about Plato in a video about Hollow Knight? Well, I think it's a surprisingly relevant philosophical framework for analyzing Hollow Knight's story and figuring out what exactly it means. What we're going to do today is dissect Hollow Knight's story on a figurative level. What does the game's story really mean? What are its themes and messages, and what tools does it use to convey them? In the process of doing all that, we're going to discover something very interesting. We're going to learn that we can't trust everything the game tells us. We can't rely on the shadows we see within and the sounds that come from the higher beings. We are the prisoners in the cave of Hallownest. Hollow Knight hides its true nature, and we're going to get to the bottom of it. Before we begin, just a couple of quick things. First, we will be spoiling the entirety of Hollow Knight, from the bosses we fight to the ending of the story. We'll be focused only on the first game, so don't worry, there won't be any random Silksong spoilers. Second, as this is a thematic analysis of Hollow Knight, we won't be talking much about the gameplay. I might say something about it here and there, but it won't be our primary focus. Lastly, Hollow Knight is a game that tells its story mostly through lore. Not much plot happens in the present. We're left to our own devices to figure out what's actually going on in the game on a literal level, let alone the figurative side that we're attempting today. Because of this, it's very well possible that you'll disagree with some or all of what I say in this analysis. That's totally fine, and I don't claim my interpretation to be any more valid than anyone else's. I'm pretty confident I at least have the big picture of the literal story understood though, so don't worry on that front. Shout out to all the lore wikis out there. Alright, we're now ready to begin. Welcome to Hollow Knight. Let's begin with a very brief summary of Hollow Knight's plot so we can all get on the same page in case you aren't super into the game's lore. I'll keep it short and sweet and just go over the most important details. If you're already familiar, feel free to skip ahead to the next section. Okay, here we go. Back in the olden days of Hallownest, the bugs that lived there were simple-minded, and the land was ruled by a higher being known as the Radiants. It was worshipped by the Moth tribe in particular, and maybe the other bug species too. One day, a different higher being known as the Pale King arrived in Hallownest, and he usurped the kingdom from the Radiants. He expanded the minds of the population, granting the bugs the ability to form complex thought, and he would eventually start being worshipped as a god king. The Radiants lost most of its power and influence as the kingdom's population forgot about it, and the Radiants, understandably, didn't like that. The Radiants spread an infection across Hallownest that would cause bugs to lose their free will and forcibly remember the Radiants. This infection is the main problem we deal with in the events of the game itself. Nearly every enemy in Hallownest is infected by the Radiants. The Pale King understood the threat of the infection, so he devised a plan to save the kingdom's people. He would create an empty vessel that could contain the Radiants. An empty vessel with no mind to think or will to break. It would be able to absorb the Radiance inside of itself, and its empty soul would protect it from the infection. To create many potential vessels, he had hundreds of children with another higher being, the White Lady, and had their eggs bathed in the void at the abyss of Hallownest. The void is the mortal enemy of the Radiance, and its emptiness was the quality the Pale King needed for the vessel. Eventually, one child successfully ascended from the abyss, and the Pale King took it under his wing to prepare for becoming the vessel to seal away the Radiants forever. The vessel and the Radiants were successfully locked away in the Temple of the Black Egg, with the door being magically sealed by the collective strength of 3 dreamers. The Dreamers are bugs who volunteer to enter a permanent slumber so they can dedicate all of their will to keeping the temple shut. Unfortunately, the Pale King's plan failed. The infection leaked out of the temple, and Hallownest fell to ruin. At the time the game begins, the Pale King is already dead. Alright, that should do it. That's the major premise of the game's story. I'm leaving out some details, but we don't need to get into all of them right now. Let's move on to the actual analysis of the game, starting with our protagonist. It's pretty intriguing how Hollow Knight constructs its first impression for its audience. I'm confident that every single player who came into the game with no prior knowledge made an unconscious assumption, that the player character is the Hollow Knight. We learn pretty quickly that the game is about bugs, but our player character doesn't seem to be a bug. When we die, we see that we fracture into a literal ghost, and our eyes are creepy and full of an unnatural void. We also have a nail that resembles a sword for our weapon, so our appearance reasonably matches the title Hollow Knight. There's also probably some collective influence from another video game, Shovel Knight, in building this assumption. Shovel Knight is one of the most influential indie games ever, and since Hollow Knight is also an indie game, its target audience probably has at least heard of Shovel Knight before. In Shovel Knight, the player character is, well, the Shovel Knight. It logically follows that in Hollow Knight, we are, then, the Hollow Knight. But, as you may already know, this isn't the case. The player character is simply known as the Knight. The Hollow Knight is a different character. The question I now want to ask is, why? Why build the game in such a way to mislead the player on the identity of its protagonist? Okay, well, they had no control over Shovel Knight, but the design thing is absolutely true, and the only explicit evidence for us not being the Hollow Knight is the statue in the City of Tears. We don't have nearly the full context of the world and story when we see it, though, so the statue could still mean anything. My main point is that there was every opportunity to make clear that our character is just the Knight, but the game doesn't do that. Why? Well, the first reason is likely because the name drop of the Hollow Knight in the final boss fight is incredibly cool. It makes the player recontextualize the entire adventure right before the final boss rush, which creates a very strong emotional reaction. A blend of hype, confusion, fear, and realization. It's definitely up there for one of the coolest title drops in any game ever. The second reason, though, is a bit narratively deeper than creating a cool moment. The player's understanding of the identity of the Hollow Knight is directly tied to the themes of the game's story. So the whole point of the Hollow Knight as a character is it wasn't actually so hollow. It was raised by the Pale King, and he was too kind of a father. The Hollow Knight's upbringing allowed it to develop a mind to think and a will to break, so it, too, became vulnerable to the Radiance's infection. It could only contain the Radiance for so long before its impurity got the best of it. Our character's primary motivation is to take the place of the Hollow Knight in the temple. We still hold the instinct of wanting to imprison the Radiance, but the difference between us and the Hollow Knight is that we never felt the love of the Pale King. In theory, that means we should be more hollow than the Hollow Knight proper, so we have a chance at success. The default ending of the game has us kill the Hollow Knight and absorb the infection into ourselves, but the game leaves it ambiguous on whether our efforts were truly successful. With all that in mind, you could make the argument that there's a double fake-out going on here. We learn the final boss is the one named Hollow Knight, not the player character, despite our assumptions. However, the Hollow Knight itself might be less hollow than we are. So does that mean we're the Hollow Knight after all? And to that, I would answer, no. No, I don't think so. You see, this interpretation of the game's events is fairly common. I've even seen some of those IQ bell curve memes about it. You know, how the surface level incorrect interpretation actually wraps around to being true from a different angle? I could not disagree more, though. I don't think the player character is the real Hollow Knight, and we'll be getting into why shortly, but there's another side of the argument I want to address as well. One that aims to transcend the bell curve meme. The real truth, that there is no Hollow Knight. This reading is basically claiming that the Pale King's plan was never going to work because a true empty vessel was impossible to create. This angle is one I find a lot more compelling, and we'll be diving deeper into it too, but I'm still not fully satisfied by it. I think there really is a Hollow Knight in the game, but to figure out who the true Hollow Knight is, we're going to have to go in a lot of different directions. First, we need to look more closely at why I disagree with the claim that the player character is the real Hollow Knight, rather than me just casually dismissing it. Afterward, we'll talk more about the argument that creating a Hollow Knight was impossible in the first place, which will take us along a more thematic and symbolic reading of the story. Once we've determined what the themes and messages of the game really are, we'll have all the tools we need to answer our motivating questions. Who is the thematic Hollow Knight, and how does Plato's Allegory of the Cave fit into all of this? Strap in, because we're just getting started. The first thing we need to prove is that the knight, our player character, isn't so hollow itself either. The difficult part of doing this is it's a little murky when we're discussing the actions of a fully player-controlled, fully silent protagonist. We can't really attribute deeds like saving Zote to the knight because that's more of the player's choice, even if saving Zote would be some evidence for the presence of emotion in the knight. What is fair game for evidence then? I think the best way to go about it would be to look at events on the critical path of the game. Then we can maybe look for side content for supplemental evidence. What must we do to reach the ending of the story? Well, even that isn't technically 100% clear, but I'm going to consider the true ending the one when we actually fight the Radiants. I feel like that shouldn't be controversial, but you never know, so I'll explicitly say it. After we've obtained both halves of the King Soul by visiting the Hallownest Queen and scaling the White Palace, a new area opens up to us in the Abyss. It's filled with broken skulls and loose shades of other vessels like the Knight, and if we travel to the very bottom of it, we find a shiny rock. A rock so shiny that it shows us our reflection. This gives us a unique opportunity. For the entire game, we've been using our dream nail to read the minds and enter the dreams of others, but now our own body is in our line of sight, so we can use the dream nail on ourselves. And I want to stop us right there. Let's think about this for a second. Why would the knight dream nail itself? This is a required step to get the true ending of the game, and it's not something that any NPC directs the knight to do. It's something done of its own volition, but how does this help the knight progress toward its programmed goal of containing the Radiance? The answer is, it doesn't. It's not like the knight can know beforehand that dream nailing itself is the key to obtaining the Void Heart that would then convince Hornet to help in the Hollow Knight fight. No, I think the answer is something far more basic in nature. The knight was simply curious about itself. If that's true, then I feel like we could technically already dismiss the claim that the player knight is the real Hollow Knight. A sense of self-curiosity seems like a pretty good sign that our character has an ego, that it's sentient in some way beyond what it's biologically programmed to do. The criteria for a Hollow Knight stated by the Pale King himself was an absolute no mind to think and no will to break. If there's any impurity, then we can't say that it's a true Hollow Knight. We can do better than just leaving it there, though. There's a secret room in Deep Nest near its hot spring and bench area. If we can make it up on a ledge to the left and break the wall, we'll find a new area with a grub, but there's actually another hidden wall in this hidden area. In this second secret area, we find a copy of ourselves. If we chase it down, we'll be lured into its trap as it actually reveals itself to be Nosk, a mimicking spider, and it attacks us. What's interesting about Nosk is that it's explicitly hunting other vessels, and it's working. In its boss arena, we can see the bodies of our brethren hanging from the ceiling. That means, on some level, the vessels are drawn to imagery of themselves. I don't think this is a coincidence. We know that the Void attacks indiscriminately when it's not unified, explaining why the Sibling Shades attack us in the Abyss, but that's not how Nosk operates. It actively baits us to chase it, showing its false appearance just out of reach to encourage our curiosity. I have to assume it's been employing this tactic for a while, given the amount of bodies in its boss arena. With that in mind, that means for a vessel to be lured into Nosk's arena, it would have to specifically be seeking out Nosk. That's not indiscriminate violence, it's the vessels getting curious by their own image. Nosk isn't on the critical path of the game, however. I'm sure many players don't even know it exists given how out of the way it is, but that's okay. It doesn't really matter if Nosk is on the critical path because we can see that it was successful with other vessels in the past. That's an objective fact with no player influence behind it. If these vessels had self-curiosity, I think it's safe to assume that our knight has the same trait, which reinforces what we talked about with dream nailing our reflection. In short, it seems like all the vessels, including ours, have some sort of innate attraction to their own image, which isn't exactly a quality you would want in a hypothetical Hollow Knight. That means our knight isn't the true Hollow Knight, and we didn't even have to factor in all the optional content for saving and helping other bugs and such. So as a byproduct of us proving why the knight isn't the true Hollow Knight, we pretty much also proved that none of the vessels we see in-game are a proper Hollow Knight either. That leads naturally to the second question on our agenda. Was the Pale King's plan doomed to fail? Just because it didn't work out doesn't necessarily mean it was fatally flawed. It could have just been a risk that didn't pan out, or maybe the Pale King missed a step somewhere? What I'm interested in answering now is, was it even possible for the Pale King's plan to succeed? If it wasn't, then how can we say a real Hollow Knight exists in the game at all? Well, this might come as a surprise, but I don't actually think these statements contradict each other. I'm claiming now that the Pale King's plan really was impossible, but there is still a character worthy of the Hollow Knight title in the game. To understand how to square these ideas, we're going to have to dig into the story's themes. What is the story of Hollow Knight about on a deeper level? A good place to start would probably be the Pale King himself, since he's directly tied to everything that happens in the game. The key trait of the Pale King to understand is that, while he is certainly flawed, he truly wanted what was best for the people of Hallownest. He took over the Radiance's domain, but every action he took afterward was meant to raise the kingdom's people. He willingly abandoned his godly form so he could look more similar to his subjects. He literally ascended the minds of his subjects to be more similar to him. As far as I'm aware, Hallownest under the Pale King's rule was relatively stable and peaceful. It's true that the kingdom's bugs worshipped the Pale King to the point of completely forgetting their former god, but that's a result of the Pale King's kindness. The Pale King didn't intentionally steal the Radiance's followers, as far as we know. They chose to follow the Pale King instead because of his benevolence. It's kind of easy to think the worst of the Pale King if we just look at his actions in a vacuum. A foreign god just shows up one day, steals the loyalty of the kingdom's people, starts being worshipped, and lives in a lavish palace. However, I don't think there's evidence to suggest the Pale King held malintent any step of the way. Only actions that show the Pale King clearly cared about the kingdom's bugs. There's a nice piece of storytelling through gameplay that demonstrates this concept, actually. There's a statue of the Pale King in the ancient basin that will ask us to make an offering of all our geo. That's a pretty steep demand, and if we have less than 3,000 on us, it will just take all of our money and give us nothing in return. If that was the end of the story, it'd be a nice way to communicate that worship of the Pale King held the bugs back. Blind devotion that ultimately harmed them with no tangible benefit. But that's not the end of the story. As soon as we hit 3,000 total geo donated, the statue will grant us a soul vessel fragment, a rare, valuable upgrade material. It won't take any more of our money afterward. I view this as a nice example of the relationship the Pale King held with Hallownest. The Pale King benefits from Hallownest's worship since higher beings in this universe seem to get stronger the more followers they have, but the Pale King is generous to them in return. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. Establishing the Pale King's kindness is important to get us to empathize with him, at least a little, because the next part of his story doesn't do him any favors. He fathered hundreds of children, bathed their eggs in void to try to strip them of free will and emotions. Also, one might rise from the abyss as a vessel that could be permanently sealed away to contain a rival god. This is the story at the heart of all of Hollow Knight's lore, but I want to highlight a specific detail of the whole summary. The fact that the vessels are the Pale King's children. Why? What does this detail add to the story of the game? Look, I don't know fully how the Void works in the lore, but it kind of seems unnecessary to have the vessels be directly related to the Pale King, at a surface level at least. The Void itself seems to be some sort of higher being like the Pale King and the Radiance, so I think it would have still made sense lore-wise if these vessels were purely Void creatures or something. Alternatively, if they wanted to use normal bug eggs, they could have been taken from volunteers of the kingdom's citizens. We know everyone in the kingdom worshipped the Pale King, and this direction would add an extra element of tragedy of using the kingdom's future in a futile attempt to save the present. I guess you lose out on the divine blood of the vessel that way, but the details like that have ways of being figured out. My main point is that, of all the directions the story could have gone, why decide to have the vessels be the Pale King's children? Well, I think it's for a very simple reason. The themes and messages of Hollow Knight's story revolve around the relationship parents have with their children. Let's try taking away the specific in-universe details of the Pale King's plan and see what the generic description looks like. A father bears children specifically to accomplish a goal he had in mind. He set up the circumstances of their birth such that they'd know nothing but the path he had set out for them. Once born, he demanded absolute perfection. A single blemish would have them deemed a failure, and once a worthy candidate from his offspring arose, he isolated the child from its siblings to further groom them for their role. That sounds eerily similar to circumstances we see in real life, doesn't it? Parents setting lofty expectations for their kids, demanding perfectionism and predetermining their paths in life. We can read the story of the Pale King and the vessels as an allegory for this phenomenon. The Pale King's plan was to create a perfect vessel with no blemishes that could contain the radiance, and I don't think that's much different from, say, a family of doctors raising their kid with a strict studying mindset so they, too, could become a doctor. We could even go a bit further and say the radiance itself is a symbol of this idea of perfectionism. It's as bright and shiny as the sun, which makes it look appealing, but in reality, it completely consumes you. I'm using perfectionism kind of broadly here to essentially mean the perfect life that some parents envision and force upon their children. As I think we're all well aware, crushing expectations from parents doesn't tend to work out too well for their kids. From that angle, the Radiance's infection is a horribly dark manifestation of how much damage this kind of stuff can do. The story of Hollow Knight is explicitly condemning this behavior, and it tries to make sure we don't mistake the root of the issue for something else. That's why it's so important for the Pale King to be a genuinely kind soul. He wasn't stealing the future of his children for selfish reasons. He was really trying to save his kingdom. He knew it was wrong, but he did it anyway. This is just as applicable to the real world. Parents don't necessarily have to be evil to set these kinds of expectations on their kids. In fact, I'd wager many of them really believe they're doing the right thing. They want a better future for their kids, so they try to keep them on a specific track with a good outcome on paper. If Hollow Knight were just a cautionary tale on some of the dangers of raising children, that'd still be all well and good, but that's not where the game's story ends. It also tells us what children in these types of circumstances should do to escape the path set out for them, or at least preserve their mental health until they're in a position to do so. Of course, the majority of children are unfortunately unable to do much while they lack full independence. This, however, is at least possible for every child to try. It's something they innately have within themselves. Every single person in the world can do it, because nobody can take it away from you. It's your ability to look inward. The Pale King's plan was never going to work because every living person is aware of themselves. Even the vessels clearly demonstrated self-curiosity. That already goes against the literal no mind to think and no will to break the Pale King chants in-game, but let's continue with our allegorical reading and see if we can use the themes of the story to disprove the mantra as well. We can liken the Pale King's ideal vessel criteria to a parent stripping their child of their independence in life. No mind to think, meaning nothing to question the path set out for them. No will to break, meaning taking on the heavy burden of expectation without complaint. To mentally survive this immense pressure, what we need to do is look inside ourselves to find the true nature of why we are the way we are. Is our path in life what we decided for ourselves, or are we merely seeing shadows of what our life really is, projected by our parents? That's what we need to be asking ourselves to reawaken a mind and will suppressed in favor of another's. It's all about the why. That brings us back to Plato's Allegory of the Cave. I'll admit it's not necessarily a one-to-one fit for Hollow Knight's story, and if it were, that'd be pretty weird, but I think there's enough similarities to when it's worth talking about. The vessels in the abyss are the prisoners of the cave. They literally only see shadows, the sibling shade enemies and other creations of the void. These are the most basic elements of life in the game, and they're being cast into the void by an enlightened higher being. The Pale King is using the shades to manipulate the vessel's perception of reality. If all they know is void from the moment they're born, the path in life set for them by their father, then they really believe that is their reality. But as we know by now, this couldn't erase that fundamental self-curiosity trait. That trait is what allows the vessels to ask why. Why is life like this? Why are we the void? Just like in the Allegory, the path to enlightenment is found by figuring out the nature of existence, the why, and the way we reach the true ending of the game requires us to ask the why. So there you have it. Hollow Knight is a game about parent-child relationships, the crushing weight of expectations, and how parents dictating their kids' courses in life doesn't have to come from a place of malice to create horrible results. To withstand it all, we need to be able to ask ourselves why. Learning and understanding the why is the first step to taking back control of your own track in life. That sounds pretty good to me, but there's still one little tiny question we've yet to answer. Who is the real Hollow Knight? It's time to put the pieces together, and I have a little secret for you. We've already discussed all the main clues, and the real Hollow Knight is a character we've already talked about. On screen now is every single character I've mentioned by name or alluded to somehow in this video. The Knight, Hornet, the Hollow Knight, the Pale King, the Radiance, the Dreamers, the miscellaneous other vessels, Nosk, the White Lady, and Zote. Do you have an idea? If not, I'll give you a hand. Obviously, it's not the Knight or the miscellaneous other vessels. We just spent the majority of our discussion proving why it's not them. The title Hollow Knight is also 2 words, in case you didn't notice. I think the proper Hollow Knight does need to be a knight or warrior of some kind, which is going to take off the White Lady, the Dreamers, the Radiance, and Nosk. I'm not sure if the Pale King ever actually fights in the lore, but I guess he did kind of wage a war against the Radiance. Well, regardless, he's clearly not hollow with how complex of a character he is, so we can take him off the list. Continuing that thought, Hornet is like the deuteragonist of the game, and directly tells us she doesn't even have an empty portion, so she's out too. And Zote? The man lives by 57 precepts. That gives him power, courage, wisdom, and meaning to live in general. He can't be the Hollow Knight. But if we take Zote off the list, then that just leaves the Hollow Knight? After all this, the Hollow Knight is literally just the Hollow Knight? Wait, hang on, do you remember the very first thing we analyzed? Like, after the intro and lore recap? It was how the game misleads us on who the Hollow Knight is for its entire duration until the final boss fight. The title drop as the Hollow Knight is unshackled is one of the most memorable moments in the game, and like I said, up there for one of the best title drops ever. It's such a cool feeling to have our fundamental understanding of the game flipped on its head in a way that feels earned. Would the game really want to take that away from us? Would it really want to say that, despite how epic of a reveal it is, the Hollow Knight isn't the true Hollow Knight after all? How can this be possible, though? Well, let's calm down. Let's go over what we know and convince ourselves that we weren't misled. We'll probably get a little sidetracked along the way, but we'll tie it all together soon enough. We've long since established that the Hollow Knight developed emotions. It was raised in kindness by the Pale King, despite his lofty expectations for his child. It's not even an assumption either, it's explicitly shown to us. Within the White Palace is a hidden area called the Path of Pain, the most difficult platforming section of the game by far. The music playing in the background for the entire section is the Sealed Vessel theme, the theme of the Hollow Knight. All the soul-restoring statues here are modeled after the Hollow Knight, too. If we manage to endure all the trials, we're rewarded with a single 2-second cutscene. It's a flashback of the Pale King and the Hollow Knight looking across the sky, followed by the Hollow Knight taking a brief glance at its father, confirming its consciousness. The storytelling through gameplay in the Path of Pain is astounding. All the imagery and music relating to the Hollow Knight within it make it clear that this area is a representation of the Hollow Knight's path in life. While the Pale King treated it with kindness, that doesn't change how the Hollow Knight was groomed to be an emotionless vessel with the weight of the entire kingdom resting on its shoulders. The Path of Pain's name itself is representative of how we're meant to view the Hollow Knight's existence. and the extreme difficulty of the area reinforces it. We're meant to feel the pain the Hollow Knight felt. There's even another layer beyond this, though. At its core, I would describe the game Hollow Knight as a fusion between a Metroidvania and a Souls-like, with minor platforming elements. There are certainly areas where you're expected to platform, but this is almost never actually a challenge. It's a part of the gameplay loop, but it's not the main draw. However, the Path of Pain, and the White Palace as a whole actually, flip the game's design on its head. There's nothing to explore in these areas. There are no collectibles or branching paths except for the Path of Pain itself, which has no material reward. Combat is de-emphasized with only a few Kingsguards that don't respawn appearing in the entire map. The main gameplay loop is replaced by the most difficult platforming challenges in the game by far. I don't think fans of Hollow Knight like the game for its platforming. It's not bad at all, let me make that clear, but it's just not the main focus. The first time I played the game, at least, the White Palace was my least favorite area of the game because I just didn't feel like playing a linear, challenging platformer. I wanted to explore and have smooth, snappy combat like I've grown to expect the game to provide. I don't think difficult platforming is what the player, on average, wants to do when playing the game. And when we put it like that, it thematically ties in perfectly to the Pale King and the Hollow Knight. Let's talk about the Pale King first. The Pale King didn't want to go down the path he did. He only did it because he thought he must. That's exactly what the player does in the White Palace. We mirror the path of the Pale King by going in a direction we probably don't want, but we must do so to get the best ending. It's the same idea as the Path of Pain reflecting the Hollow Knight's journey. The White Palace being a requirement for the best ending is still consistent with the Pale King's journey, since, in a way, the Pale King's plan technically worked, right? Just not how he expected, and also not in the most important ways. He failed to create a truly pure hollow vessel, but one of the potential vessels was victorious. It was too late to save the kingdom, but the Pale King's efforts did eventually indirectly lead to the Radiance's downfall, at least. Don't worry, we're not going back on everything we analyzed previously and saying the Pale King was actually justified all along or something. The White Palace being required is still consistent with the allegory from earlier. The Pale King was only successful in the sense that he fathered one of the kids that would then enact a plan that worked. The knight learning the why of itself and its creation is what allows it to fight the Radiance directly, which, remember, we're reading as a symbol for this parent-child perfectionism concept. Walking the path of the Pale King is a step in the journey to learning the why, which makes sense since understanding our parents that put us in this situation is half the battle. Now, getting back to the Hollow Knight and the Path of Pain. It's an optional area with no material reward. We're only treated to that 2-second cutscene that kind of just confirms what we already know. The Hollow Knight had emotions. We don't need to conquer the Path of Pain to understand what's going through its mind when it stabs itself during its boss fight. We also know just by reading the previous events of the game closely that none of the vessels were truly hollow in the first place. The Pale King's fatherly love being shown is basically just an affirmation of his kindness and what we already know to be true. What's the point of the Path of Pain then? Well, the point is, there isn't a point. I've probably said it 10 times by now, but just one last time for good measure. The Pale King's plan at creating a perfect hollow vessel was never going to work. All the suffering inflicted on the Hollow Knight was pointless. It was completely consumed by the Radiance and the infection leaked out of the temple anyway. Symbolically speaking, we can read this as the Hollow Knight succumbing to the pressure from its father of being perfect. It was utterly consumed by the thought of living up to expectations, and lost itself as a result. It only longs for its own death in the present. What was it all for? Unfortunately, it was for nothing, and that's exactly why the Hollow Knight is the true figurative Hollow Knight at the end of it all. The word hollow means empty. There's a whole outer shell, but nothing on the inside. No mind to think, no will to break, no voice to cry suffering, nothing. It had to be truly empty to trap the Radiance within, but that's not the only definition of the word hollow. There's a second one, and this is the real plot twist. The title Hollow Knight isn't referring to an empty knight. It's referring to a knight without significance or meaning. A knight fighting a war that it could never win. That is the real essence of the Hollow Knight. It never feels good to end on a depressing note, but I don't really know how else to wrap things up. The story of Hollow Knight is a tragedy after all. Well, maybe was is a better word because the tragedy already happened when the game started. We can still learn from it, though. We need to consciously acknowledge the damage that parents' expectations can do to their children, even unintentionally. Children are unfortunately not typically in a position to be able to escape unhealthy family dynamics, so I would say the onus is on the parents here to take in the lesson of, don't do that. Don't be like the Pale King. Don't turn your child into a Hollow Knight. For children in that situation, though, then I think that Plato-esque concept of internalizing the why is the best they could reasonably do. Understanding that this crushing weight and pressure isn't an inherent part of them. It's something that can and will pass, so hopefully they can withstand it until they are able to make their own choices in life. We have now finally reached the end. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe so I can make more videos like these. If you particularly liked this video, then you'd probably also enjoy my story analyses of Final Fantasy VIII and Majora's Mask, which go in similar directions. Before we truly end, there are a couple of things I wanted to mention that didn't quite fit anywhere in the script. First, when I was recording footage for this video, I somehow glitched out of bounds completely unintentionally. I hit this elevator spike in the City of Tears in a weird way, and when I respawned, I think the game still had me tied to the elevator somehow, because when I hit the lever, I just, took off? There wasn't much to do out of bounds, but I discovered that these spikes on the outside wall don't have a hitbox attached to them. It was pretty funny in the moment. Maybe you'll get a kick out of it too. Second, I have to say at least something about Silksong, right? I still won't give any spoilers, but since it's the topical game, I'll give you my 2 cents. I really liked it. Playing through it was what actually inspired me to make this video. As soon as I finished Silksong, I basically went straight into replaying the first game and writing this script. After playing the games back to back, I think I actually surprisingly like the first game more. I just am a bigger fan of its vibe, I guess is the best way I can put it. I don't know. I haven't fully dived into the Silksong lore yet, so maybe my opinion will change in the future. Alright, that's it for real. Thank you once again for watching, and see you next time.